So we've all got our favourite Battlefield weapons that we love to use on a regular basis, and we've all got ones that we wouldn't touch with a barge pole. Out of all those hundreds of guns available to equip in the Battlefield games, there's bound to be a few stinkers thrown into the mix. That don't really bring anything new to the table, don't really offer us with any kind of advantage, and don't really seem like very good options to use for general play, often seeming a bit pointless or substandard in performance. These are the kind of guns we're going to be looking at in this video. The Battlefield primary weapons that I consider to be some of the worst in the series, for their own specific reasons of course. This one's a bit of a subjective topic, because everyone's got their own idea of what's good and what's bad, so don't get too rattled if you see your all-time favourite gun pop up on this list. At the end of the day, it's all just down to opinion. I will say that none of the guns in this video are completely useless, because they can all still be deadly in their own ways and in certain situations, as you'll see in the gameplay. But although they're not all particularly bad weapons, a lot of them just don't seem like worthy choices to pick, as there's other guns with better stats that kinda make the ones in this list seem a bit crappy in comparison. So without further ado, here's my top 10 worst primary weapons in the Battlefield games. So kicking off the list in 10th place, we've got Battlefield 4's Scout Elite, a sniper rifle that often struggles to be a sniper rifle. If you're a Battlefield Hardline fan, you'll probably remember this gun quite well, because it actually turned out to be one of Hardline's most effective scout rifles, having a really nice balance of power and speed. But on Battlefield 4 on the other hand, it was pretty much the complete opposite, often being a gun that a lot of people forgot was even there, down to it arguably being the worst bolt action rifle in the game. That's not because Battlefield 4 Scout Elite was a pile of crap, it still did the job okay enough and picked off weakened enemies quite effectively, though its biggest problem was down to the fact that it had a far lower minimum damage output than everything else, with damage dropping down to as low as 36, basically making it a free shot kill over 90 meters. This made it a far less consistent weapon to use, especially for long range sniping. It was a bit of a hitmarker machine at times, and in battles with other snipers, you'd often be at a huge disadvantage, with them often being able to take you down in one less shot. It wouldn't even be too bad if this gun offered you something extra in return, like a nippier bullet speed or a much faster fire rate. But it just didn't, having a very average fire rate and muzzle velocity, while even having a heavier bullet drop than the other rifles too, making it an even trickier weapon to use against players further away. The Scout Elite just didn't really give you any reason to use it, kinda making it a bit naff compared to the other sniper rifles. I mean, why would you want to pick a gun that can take 3 shots to kill, when all the others only take 2? Next up in our 9th place spot is the HCAR from Battlefield Hardline, essentially a modernised version of the BAR, which sounds a lot more interesting than it actually is. The thing about the HCAR is, it's not actually a terrible weapon in the game, it's just outclassed by pretty much all of the other battle rifles, kinda making it seem like a pointless addition. It's got very similar stats to its counterparts, dealing the same high damage values and kicking around quite heavily, but it's also plagued with a really dopey fire rate of 450 RPM, giving it some of the slowest kill times of the pack. The only good thing is the fact that this gun has a slightly bigger magazine than average, but it's still going to kick around quite violently nevertheless, forcing you to tap the trigger and fire in bursts, lengthening those kill times even more. I guess you could say that slower fire rate helps to make the HCAR a bit easier to control in closer range fights, because the others do seem to kick around a bit more due to them shooting quicker. But if you slap a few attachments onto them, they're going to feel pretty similar to the HCAR anyway, but kill quicker. You'll often get outgunned because of the HCAR's crappy fire rate, especially in situations where there's a few enemies on screen at once. And although the gun can still be a bit of a beast at times in CQC, if you miss a bullet or two in a gunfight, it'll probably make all the difference, and you'll usually end up dead on the floor. With all that said though, the HCAR is still one of the more viable options in this list, despite being a bit inferior, hence why it only makes 9th place. So another fairly pointless addition is Battlefield 5's S2200, an awkward bugger of a gun that doesn't really give you any kind of useful advantage over the other MMGs. Now this weapon's drawbacks are really quite obvious. It's a medium machine gun with a relatively quick fire rate that only holds 30 bloody rounds, which as far as it goes for weapons of this category is barely anything. The S2200 loves to mess you around while you play, not only because you've got to rely on that bipod being set up to be accurate beyond smooching range, but because it's constantly going to be running out of shots and forcing you to reload, often making it a fairly awkward thing to use. The S2200 might be quite accurate, but it's got one of the nastiest vertical kick values of the bunch, matching up to the MG42. So a lot of the bullets you fling out will end up flying over your target's head, making it one of the trickier weapons to control in the game. You could argue that it's an offensive MMG, designed to be used with aggressive tactics within shorter sightlines, but you'll still need to whip that bipod out if you want to be accurate, taking some time to do, thus giving the enemy more time to return the fire. Equipping that light bolt specialization might seem to make the gun more viable, but it just ends up amplifying its problems, firing faster, but also running out of ammo even quicker, and making the recoil even harder to control too. If you're going to use an MMG in Battlefield 5, you're simply better off just using any of the others. They can pretty much do the exact same thing as the S2200, but a lot more reliably, without all the faffing about. Coming in at 7th place is a pretty weird looking gun called the Grota 4, a PDW from Battlefield 4's engineer class that's got quite a lot of strong negative traits. It might have a pretty rubbish sight picture, but that's probably the least of this gun's issues, because you're going to be very limited with what you can do with it and how you can use it effectively. The Grota 4's biggest snag is mainly due to its poor reliability, the fact that it can only hold 21 rounds in its magazines, and the fact that those magazines take friggin' ages to swap over. Having the smallest magazines and longest reload times in the class isn't exactly a great combination to have, and if you completely empty your magazine, which you'll probably end up doing quite a lot naturally as you play, then it's going to take almost 4 seconds to get back into the action. 4 seconds where you're going to be extremely vulnerable. The Grota 4's also got a suppressor permanently attached to its gun, lowering that muzzle velocity, thus making it trickier to use over distance. Plus it's also got one of the heaviest vertical kick readings of all the PDWs as well, forcing the weapon to kick around quite a lot, making it even harder to use still. So what the hell does this gun actually do right? Well, it does generally deal a little bit more damage than a lot of the other PDWs, sometimes letting it kill in one less shot. It's also somewhat accurate, due to that horizontal recoil being on the lower end of the spectrum, but these factors still don't exactly make up for those really awkward reliability issues, with the Grota 4 kinda acting like a less dangerous version of the AS-FAL. It might seem like an interesting weapon, but it's definitely not worth choosing over the others, with its bad aspects really overshadowing the good. So when it comes down to shotguns in Battlefield games, they all generally do the same sort of thing, blasting out a load of pellets to inflict high damage within closer ranges. The M97 trench gun was a pretty deadly option when it first came into the scene in Battlefield 1. Perhaps not the most popular boomstick, down to that spot being reserved for the Model 10A, but nevertheless it was still a decent weapon with a nice balance of stats, ending up in the hands of a lot of players on the front line. When it came back a few years later, however, in Battlefield 5, essentially being the first bump action shotgun to appear in that game, it wasn't exactly perceived as a very good weapon, worth choosing over the others. A lot of people tend to like grilling the 12G automatic, with that gun usually getting all the hate instead. But if you put these two guns side by side and actually look at the stats, the M1897 is clearly the inferior weapon of the two, having almost exactly the same stats, but a much slower fire rate, giving it some really poor kill times if you miss too many shots. The 12G automatic does jolt a little bit more from side to side when you open fire, but it's a hell of a lot more spammable, especially if you equip that extended magazine spec, letting it hold a few more shells. Literally the only useful thing that the M97 does over the 12G automatic is deal its maximum damage 1 meter further, but this is hardly worth sacrificing that much faster semi-auto fire rate for. Besides, if you want a shotgun with that same 1 meter range advantage, you might as well just go and pick up the Shogun Inertial instead, having the exact same damage model, recoil pattern and choke spread, yet still firing faster than the M1897, which kinda makes choosing that gun senseless, with the Shogun essentially being a better version of it. Is the M1897 useless? Definitely not, but it's just not really worth picking when there's other weapons on offer that do the same thing, but better. Probably one of the most useless variants in Battlefield 1 has got to be the patrol version of the CARCANO M91, a gun that just doesn't make any bloody sense. The main reason why you'd want to use the CARCANO M91 in the first place is because it's got the fastest bolt action fire rate of all the scout rifles, and when you're aiming down the weapon sights, you don't need to unscope to cycle the bolt. This lets you utilise the gun's speed quite well, making it really effective for firing follow-up shots to finish off weakened targets, or to account for misses, potentially giving the CARCANO some of the quickest kill times in the class, despite dishing out lower damage values and typically taking 2 shots to kill most of its victims. This is what makes the standard variant of the gun quite effective. But if you slap a scope on top of that receiver, which you'll be doing if you equip the patrol variant, then you're basically putting yourself at a pretty big disadvantage, as you'll now need to unscope after every shot, and reacquire your target as you scope back in, which is generally going to force you to fire slower, taking away the whole point of using the gun. The patrol scope might give you a clearer view of what's ahead, but you're going to be sacrificing the CARCANO's biggest perk in the process, making it a bit meaningless compared to its standard iron sight variant. If you want to use a sniper rifle with a scope, picking the patrol variant is going to be a bit of a dumb idea, because you're much better off using pretty much anything else, with the other rifles dealing a lot more damage, capable of killing in one shot, because of those sweet spot zones. It's not a bad gun, but the patrol variant just seems a bit pointless. Probably one of the daftest looking guns in the Battlefield series is the M3 Infrared from Battlefield 5, a weapon that got added late on in the game's life cycle that not only looks ridiculously awkward and clumsy, but doesn't actually give you any sort of statistical advantage either. The M3 Infrared is literally the same gun as the M1A1 carbine. It fires at the same rate, deals the same damage, uses the same magazines, reloads them at the same pace, same recoil, you get the picture. They do have slightly different specialization trees, but apart from that, they're statistically identical. But let's address the elephant in the room, which in this case comes in the form of that massive clunky infrared scope and spotlight system, which awkwardly latches itself on top of the rifle's frame, blocking off a pretty big chunk of the screen while obstructing your view. Not exactly ideal. Now you'd think having an infrared scope might give you a bit of an advantage, at least a little bit anyway. But the funny thing is, most of the time, this scope actually does the complete opposite, making enemies even harder to see, because everything just looks the same crappy bluish colour and people don't really stand out against the environment at all, hindering the M3's performance, instead of assisting it. It doesn't even work against enemies through smoke either, so if the other team are popping smoke grenades all over the place, you're still not going to have any kind of tactical advantage. There's really no reason at all to use this gun, unless you just want to look like a bit of a hipster. And if you want something that's going to perform similar, just use the M1A1 carbine on the assault class, because it's essentially the same thing, without that god-awful scope system getting in the way every couple of seconds. What do you get if you cross a revolver with a carbine? The PIEPER M1893, which, despite sounding like a pretty deadly concept, is actually weaker than most of the revolvers up close. This gun's got a hell of a lot of issues, too many issues, that don't quite make up for the things it does right, which isn't very much. Just like a revolver, it doesn't hold a lot of ammo, only having a cylinder capacity of 9 shots. And when you've used up all of those 9 shots, in typical revolver fashion, it's going to take ages to reload. 4 seconds to be precise, which is a really awkward length of time to be hanging around waiting. Now it wouldn't be too terrible if this gun had a bit of a wow factor, to make up for that small ammo count and long reload times. Perhaps if it dealt quite a lot of damage per bullet, or fired at a decent rate, then this might make it seem a bit more viable to use. But no, the M1893 doesn't really have fantastic damage stats, typically taking between 3 to 5 bullets to kill, and it doesn't shoot particularly quick either, firing at the rate of 224 RPM, which is basically the same as the Badeo revolver, a sidearm which is often a deadlier thing to use, despite being a secondary weapon. So with all these crappy traits, why would anyone want to equip the PIEPER on their loadout? Well, it does have one of the better recoil patterns in the game, barely kicking around at all as you fire away. But that's about it. No matter the range of your enemy, you're almost always going to be at a disadvantage, being outgunned by pretty much anything you come into contact with. SMGs are going to shred you up in CQC, SLRs are going to deal more damage faster over medium ranges, and snipers are going to take you down effortlessly from afar. So unless you want to wind yourself up, you're probably better off picking something else. Next up on the list is probably one of the more fun weapons to use in Battlefield 4, but at the same time one of the worst, down to how unreliable and unpredictable it can be: the Phantom Bow. This is definitely one of the most interesting weapons in the game, basically because you're going to be shooting arrows instead of bullets. You've got a few different kinds of arrows to pick from, but most of them are generally pretty rubbish, and don't really give you any kind of particular advantage, other than just to add a bit more variety. Only the broadhead arrows are capable of killing enemies with body shots in just one hit, but this is only up to about 35 meters, which isn't really that far. The other arrows deal even less damage, often making them feel really underpowered, and because you have to wait about 2 seconds in between each shot, essentially acting like a reload, This means that missing is usually always going to get you killed, giving the enemy plenty of time to gun you down while you fumble around trying to draw your next arrow. The phantom bow is a pretty ineffective thing against players far away, being a much trickier weapon to use than something like a DMR or a sniper rifle, usually taking 2 arrows to kill, having a very slow travel time, and not being compatible with any optical attachments. But it's also a really dodgy thing to be using in close quarters too, not being able to handle with multiple enemies at a time, and putting you in a lot of really awkward positions if you end up missing shots. It's a fun way to troll other players, but in a competitive sense, there isn't really enough to make it worth choosing, with it being so inconsistent. Though I will admit that getting kills with the phantom bow does feel pretty rewarding, so although it's definitely not the most effective weapon, it can still be a bit of a laugh to pull out every now and then, just to get on people's nerves. So my number 1 worst primary weapon in the Battlefield series has probably got to be the C93 carbine from Battlefield 1. A gun that not only has a bunch of mediocre stats, but is also almost impossible to use accurately, due to its toggle lock mechanism flicking up into your view, blocking those iron sights as you fire away. The C93 carbine really doesn't have much going for it, apart from the fact that it's got a suppressor, which still doesn't really do anything in Battlefield 1, apart from dampen the sound of it firing a bit. It's got a pretty substandard damage model, having one of the weakest power outputs of all the carbine type weapons, typically taking 4 bullets minimum to put another player down on the floor. And because it only holds 9 shots at most, this means that you can only comfortably kill 1 enemy per magazine, unless you manage to land nearly all your shots. But still, you're going to have a really hard time doing that because of the way this gun likes to obstruct your view, having an absolutely terrible sight picture when you're aiming and firing. The back of this gun is literally going to jolt upwards, completely blocking those iron sights, while you tap the trigger and fire at the C93's maximum rate. So of course, the only way to counter this is by firing slower, which is going to drastically increase its already crappy kill times, unless you just want to try and guess where your enemy might be and try and shoot them down blind. Funnily enough, the C93 pistol doesn't seem to have this problem, despite it technically being the same gun. Plus the pistol variant's also got some much tighter hip spread values, allowing you to bypass aiming down sights altogether if you wish, often making it feel like a more effective choice in close quarters, despite being a sidearm. The fact that secondary weapons are usually going to outperform the C93 carbine, and the fact that you can't bloody see anything when you're trying to aim at your target, quite easily makes this my worst primary weapon in the Battlefield games. It might be fairly accurate, but that's not exactly useful when you've got no vision of what's ahead. So that's my top 10 worst primary weapons in the Battlefield games. I'm sure you've all got your own idea of what guns deserve to be on the list, so feel free to share your opinions and discuss your choices down below in the comments. Make sure you stay updated with new content by subscribing and applying all notifications, and give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching guys, take it easy, and I'll be seeing you in that next episode.